All right. Hi, everybody. I will start my talk by saying that humans make mistakes, and at some point in time, errors in judgment will occur, despite everyone's best intentions and domain expertise. Now, failures and what you do with them have the potential to be defining moments in your company's journey. So, what do you do when things go wrong? Do you blame people? Do you ignore indicators of underlying problems? And continue business as usual until the next crisis occurs? Or do you encourage feedback and find ways to transform failures into learning opportunities? Hi, my name is Pranjal, and I am here to cover all these fantastic topics and some more in this talk on blameless postmortem culture. So before we proceed, I just want to make sure that this is clear. This is not a lecture on SRE or what SRE is. This is not a lecture on outages and how to resolve them. And this is not a workshop where I will teach you how to write a postmortem. But I will talk about what a good postmortem is, why it's important to write them, why it's difficult to write a good one. And I'll also cover how well-written postmortems can be an effective tool to influence culture. And towards the end, I'll cover some possibilities around what you can do after you've written a bunch of good postmortems. Here's a little bit about myself. I am currently a program manager at Google SRE. My focus is mobile client infrastructure and Firebase SRE, and I've historically worked on Gmail spam, counter reviews, and Android SRE also. I'm based out of San Francisco, and just like Dave, I also have a little puppy who can bark at any moment, so please bear with me. I've co-authored a chapter on the same topic in the SRE book, and I've co-authored another mobile report, and I give talks on both those topics. And I love traveling. I cannot wait to start traveling again, and I also love exploring different cuisines. So I think that's enough context. Now to bring everyone back on the same page, I'll talk about some general philosophy behind postmortem culture. Now, whenever an incident occurs, the person who's on call, their first priority is to mitigate the incident, fix the underlying issue, and then ensure that services return back to their normal operating conditions. Then the next big responsibility is to make sure that the system doesn't break in the same way again. Now, unless we have a formalized process of learning from these mistakes in place, they may reoccur. And then left unchecked, they can sometimes multiply in complexity or even cascade, ultimately impacting our users. Now, one of the reasons I decided to share this topic today is I want to dispel the myth that postmortem culture is only applicable to deep technical problems or companies at large scale. I think as long as one understands the basic framework, they can use it to address a variety of failures for personal growth, growth of others, encouraging accountability, sharing knowledge and best practices, and documents fact for the long term. I personally use this framework to think through a variety of situations when things have not gone according to plan. It can also be a very effective tool for leadership to be transparent about unpopular decisions and document rationale behind their choices. Introducing such a culture can seem a little bit intimidating in the beginning, but incremental change is possible, and then you can fine tune your process based on your needs. Now, one of the best ways to make use of this talk today is to think of a recent high impact failure you experienced and how that situation is handled. Then apply the principles and best practices of a blameless postmortem culture as I talk through them, and then imagine if things could have been done a little bit differently. Now, what is this postmortem I keep talking about? So it's simply a written record of an incident, its impact, actions taken to mitigate or resolve it, root cause, and the follow-up actions to prevent the incident from reoccurring. Pretty simple. So I'll quickly walk through a high-level template. The first section is all about a quick executive summary. So simple stuff like incident date, when was the postmortem written, who has access to the document, and then another set of updates like duration of the problem, estimated user impact, and resolution. Next section is background. This is specifically for people who don't have a lot of context on your postmortem. This could be new employees, people who have just recently joined your team, or people in a completely different part of the company. This also matters because postmortems once written should ideally be shared with everybody in the company for transparency reasons. Next, some concrete details are expected. So impact, root cause, recovery efforts. Then we do some deliberate introspection. So things such as what went well, what did not go well, and then my favorite, where did we get lucky? And it happens more than I honestly would like. Next, we document action items and what we expect to get out of them. This should ideally have measurable outcomes with owners, priority, and some sort of a tracking mechanism. And the last section is glossary, again meant for people who don't have enough context on your postmortem, and they can get access to quick terminology references. Now, in addition to this basic template, I would encourage you to err on the side of over-communicating and adding as much relevant information as possible in the form of graphs or anything else which may be helpful for your readers. Now, all of these sections need careful attention, and how to handle each of them, there are best practices around them also. Now, this seems like a lot of work. So do we need to write a postmortem for each and every failure? Actually, we don't. Teams actually need to define postmortem criteria before an incident occurs so that everybody knows when a postmortem is necessary. In addition to these objective triggers, one may also request a postmortem from another team if they think this is warranted under similar conditions. Personally speaking, over the years, I've seen postmortems becoming such an innate culture of SRE that they're organically expected and eagerly anticipated whenever we have a big outage or an event that's significantly undervalued in size. Another idea could be to group multiple small incidents that are similar in nature into one postmortem, and then instead of writing a small one for each small incident. Now, writing postmortems, this is important, should be looked at as a learning opportunity for the entire company and not as a punishment. But it's definitely worth acknowledging that writing a good postmortem does present an inherent cost in terms of time and or effort. So one must be deliberate in choosing when to write them. So when do you write them? Well, it depends on your needs and circumstances. So one criteria fits all approach doesn't really work. For example, a team whose primary responsibility is to ensure the reliability of a website's e-commerce infrastructure will have distinctly different success and failure metrics as compared to a team, let's say, whose primary responsibility is product management. The two teams may also have distinct set of personalities, making some of these nuances somewhat different. But some example scenarios could be you have business reasons. So let's say some users were affected or some amount of money was lost or there was loss in user trust. There could be product reasons. So the latest canary shows some metric regression, a risky change was pushed out. And there also could be people reasons. So sometimes a disruptive reorg impacts people's careers, and sometimes improper project management leads to disruptive and overloaded schedules. Now, irrespective of the situation, what matters is that these criteria are defined in the first place and then periodically revisited. Now, in my previous time that I've given this talk, I've been asked this question, who writes a postmortem? It's usually the person who's on call that writes and owns the postmortem from other collaborators, which can be people who help you debug the problem or work on the affected services or help you root cause your products, etc. But actually anybody else who wants to contribute. So far we have talked in detail about what we should do. It sounds pretty straightforward, have some post-mortem predefined criteria. When an incident occurs, deal with the outage and then fill out a template and then all your problems are magically solved. But is it really that simple? To answer that question, the next thing I want to emphasize on is the importance of ensuring psychological safety. Now, writing a postmortem just for the sake of documenting something is not good enough. In fact, if not written well, it can be counterproductive to your culture. It could lead to an atmosphere where incidents and issues are swept under the rug, leading to a greater risk. So to make the most of postmortem culture, it's absolutely imperative to keep them blameless. So what does that mean? Well, a blamelessly written postmortem assumes that everyone involved in the incident had good intentions and they did the right thing with the information that they had. It focuses on what went wrong instead of who did wrong. Now, basic human nature makes accepting failure very difficult. And sometimes these mistakes can cost a company a lot of money. So accepting that maybe I did something that caused that outage can be very distressing and embarrassing for me. In a very toxic organization, publicly acknowledging mistakes can also cost people their careers. Now, all of these fears will make it pretty much impossible for a postmortem to be valuable, fact-based, and objective. So the best practice to combat this fear is to keep your postmortems blameless. But why? So we as humans, we fear public humiliation. Speaking up under normal circumstances is hard enough. Speaking up under immense pressure when there's a big outage is much harder. And people generally tend to avoid the spotlight because they fear being ridiculed. Now, ironically, a crisis demands that someone needs to step up and then think differently and then also speak. Also, postmortems are artifacts. So now we've increased the complexity of the problem. Not only does one risk isolating themselves, they also fear being documented for that in history. So what if I make a mistake? Everyone will know. Will I get fired? Will I not be promoted? Will my future employees make fun of me? These are all very valid concerns. And then there's the potential to curb innovation and autonomy. So dreaming big, working on revolutionary ideas, brings a certain amount of inherent risk, which may very well result in failures. Now, but if a person doesn't feel psychologically safe in taking calculated risks in their environment, innovation will stagnate. They'll end up just taking orders from somebody else and instead of being creative. We cannot create future leaders. Now, it may seem like a good idea to highlight individuals when describing an outage. It feels like you're assigning ownership to someone, which may then motivate them to take responsibility. But again, the big risk of doing so is individuals becoming risk averse and fearing public humiliation. Now, this can lead to people covering up facts, reducing transparency, which could be critical to understanding an issue and preventing it from reoccurring. So blameful behavior can be pretty detrimental from a people perspective. But there's more. Now, when mistakes are hidden, systematic fixes are harder and problems are likely to reoccur. Also, blaming humans sometimes tends to result in fire human as an action item. For a moment, even if we ignore that this may not be the right thing to do, it still does not prevent reoccurrence of an outage. If the system was set up to allow a human to make that mistake in the first place, there's a higher probability that a less experienced new employee will repeat that outage. So it's pretty detrimental from a business perspective also. So now we all get the idea of what blamelessness is. Let's work on an example together to see how we can transform accusations into simple facts. Focus on what went wrong instead of who did wrong. So here's a hypothetical outage and a postmortem written for this. And here's a root cause, very hypothetical. So it says, Dylan 1 did not bother to set up alerting and check our hard drives. Of course, we ran out of space and then this disaster ensued. So take about 10 seconds and think, what's wrong with the way this is written? I'll come back to you after 10 seconds. Okay. So not only is this example very blameful, clearly, where one person is being scapegoated, it's also a little dramatic. So phrases such as disaster or of course this happened add absolutely no value to your document. What it does is erode psychological safety and make your culture toxic. You can be sure that Dylan 1 is not going to speak up when another outage happens, and the company may lose out on valuable information. A better way to express the gravity of the situation could be to gather facts and then document them objectively with metrics. So here's an example of a more blameless version. Hard drives in trading storage clusters ran out of space, and this was not noticed due to lack of alerting, and some consequences happened. Then the action item that comes out of this is to set up alerting, and then that can have an honor. Awesome. So now I'm assuming that we are all leaders here. Here's a look at some ideas we can propose and implement within our companies to foster a blameless postmortem culture. So leading by examples is one of the best things we can do. You as leaders can start writing some postmortems yourself. This will give you an opportunity to experiment with the format and then set the tone of the culture you like to see. Once you've written one artifact, share it openly. Let the readers digest the content and then get back to you with feedback and questions. Now, once people warm up with the concept and see you doing the right thing, they may feel empowered to do so themselves. Now, once your folks have accumulated a few postmortems over time, you can use this wealth of knowledge to train your future leaders. One example of this exercise is the Wheel of Misfortune. Think of it as disaster roleplay, in which previous postmortems are reenacted with a cast of employees playing roles as laid out in the postmortem. So the aim is to make the experience as real as possible and to make the educational portion of ramping up as fun as possible. Now, if you or senior management think it's appropriate, you can go a step further and create a culture of rewarding people for doing the right thing. Some examples could be you can highlight well-written postmortems in company or team meetings. You can reward closure of postmortem action items. You can acknowledge that making systems more reliable is high-impact work, and that will improve new feature development. You can also regard postmortem owners as leaders. So sometimes if somebody is set up as a go-to person for a specific sort of outage or a service, it can be very rewarding for some people. Now, if your senior management is on board, it's okay to even publicly celebrate the person who was actually the proximal cause of a big outage, but then acted effectively to either escalate or troubleshoot or mitigate or resolve that outage, and who honestly documented system failures that allowed them to make that mistake. Now, this is again to emphasize that even if it's clearly a person who can be held responsible, it's always a set of conditions that allowed this failure to happen in the first place. Now, you can do even more. So remember the slide we looked at previously? Now you did all this postmortem work, you are all experts at blamelessness, and you have magically transformed your org to become blameless. But the work is not complete yet. We still haven't done the last step. We still have not ensured that the same incident never happens again. Now, as a part of writing your blameless postmortem, you documented action items. So what happened to them? So remember the overarching reason we are doing all of this work, to prevent incidents from reoccurring. And if action items remain unaddressed, you can be sure that incidents are going to reoccur. And we've seen that sometimes they occur on a much bigger scale because the complexity of our systems and processes is not going down anytime soon. So in order to do so, review your postmortems and action items periodically. These action items can be around adding monitoring, automated rollbacks, automated release gating, maybe even a system refactoring. If your company doesn't have pre-existing tooling around postmortem action item management, there may be third-party tools that are available. Whatever process you follow, however hard or simple it is, what's important is that it needs to be done. Otherwise, there's no point of accumulating action items. Sometimes reoccurring postmortems can also give you a sneak peek into emerging themes, and you can combine them into bigger projects and then prioritize fixes accordingly. Now, with growing number of postmortems being written every quarter, a next big stretch goal could be creation of tools to aggregate them and then identify common themes across areas on product boundaries. You can encourage folks to keep their postmortems accessible. This will make sure that we're using and reinforcing the concept of failures as a learning opportunity. So let's not forget that without intentional nurturing, any sort of culture can ultimately fizzle out. Now, the breakdown of postmortem culture may not always be obvious. So, following are some common failure patterns and then recommended solutions. The first big thing is lack of time. So, quality postmortems take time to write. When a team is overloaded with tasks, the quality of postmortem suffers. To prioritize that work, track its completion, and allow teams adequate time to follow up with their associated action plan. Now, if teams are experiencing failures that mirror previous incidents, it could be time to dig a bit deeper. You could consider asking questions like, are action items taking too long to close? Are we biased towards feature velocity over reliability? Are the right action items being captured in the first place? Or maybe the service is now due for a refactor. Next big thing is blameful language while we speak with each other. So responding when someone uses blameful language can be challenging, especially if senior management is indulging in such behavior. One trick to mitigate the damage is to move the narrative in a more constructive direction. And we can remind them that investigating the source of misleading information is more beneficial than assigning blame. And then disengaging from the postmortem process is another sign that postmortem culture has started to fizzle out. If folks seem content with not discussing failures and by avoiding the issue altogether, it may be time to reinforce blamelessness and ensuring that high visibility postmortems that were recently published are reviewed for blameful flows. Now, this brings me to my almost final slide. In case you don't remember anything I said in the last 20-25 minutes, I hope these three key takeaways stay with you. So, number one, the cost of failure is education. Number two, keep your postmortems blameless. Focus on the system, not the people. And then number three, when written well, acted upon, and widely shared, blameless postmortems can be a very effective tool for driving positive cultural changes and, of course, preventing recurring errors. Now, the reason I said this was my almost final slide is here's my final slide. I wanted to make a quick pitch and say that Google SRE specifically is coming to Warsaw. Warsaw already is a Google regional hub for both engineering and business teams. It's one of the fastest growing sites in EMEA, and SRE is now also hiring for the Warsaw office. So please check out the careers page if you're interested. Thank you. Back to the studio.